si j'ai pas de retour négatif, on va peut-être pouvoir donc commencer ce troisième panel consacré à l'Europe institutionnelle qu'on a, s'il vous plaît, qu'on a intitulé donc l'Europe institutionnelle, histoire d'une impuissance. Et peut-être en deux mots, avant de céder la parole aux intervenantes, sur cette Europe institutionnelle, le point de départ de cette histoire politique, disons, commence en 1957, au moment où est signé le traité de Rome, qui fonde donc la communauté économique européenne, ancêtre de l'Union européenne, qui, elle, apparaît officiellement avec le traité de Maastricht en 1992. C'est un cadre fondateur, on va y revenir, les intervenantes vont y revenir, c'est un cadre fondateur qui a façonné la posture extérieure de la communauté européenne, dont l'ambition a été, formellement, disons, de se présenter comme un acteur normatif et de promouvoir le droit international et le multilatéralisme. Et donc, progressivement, vous avez des institutions européennes qui se structurent et qui permettent à l'Union européenne de se doter d'une diplomatie commune, bien qu'évidemment elle soit marquée par les divergences entre les différents États membres. Et c'est dans ce contexte qu'elle a commencé à définir sa position sur la question palestinienne. Alors je le dis vraiment très rapidement, mais le premier tournant majeur intervient avec la déclaration de Venise en 1980, la déclaration de Berlin en 1999, et puis dans les années 90, un ensemble d'initiatives, notamment au moment du processus d'Oslo. Voilà, je ne vais pas en dire plus. Je vais céder la parole immédiatement à nos intervenantes. La première d'entre elles, Daniela Huber. Vous êtes maîtresse de conférence au département de sciences politiques de l'Université Roma en Italie. Vous êtes également conseillère scientifique du programme Méditerranée, Moyen-Orient et Afrique de l'Institut des Affaires internationales. Et vous allez nous parler de l'évolution historique du rôle de l'Europe dans le conflit, dans une intervention que vous avez intitulée « De la communauté européenne à l'Union européenne en Israël-Palestine, continuité et rupture ». Je vous en prie.
Okay, does this work? I don't know if there are my slides. I need to press this. Yes, okay, good. Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizing team for organizing this conference and for hosting us here despite all the difficult circumstances, for your resilience and courage to do this. Now, I will present a more historical view. Let's say I'm a political scientist, so it's not really historical, but I will start from the Rome Treaty. And what I will present today is based on two works of mine. The first is a book I have published 4 years ago with State University of New York Press, and an article for the latter part, which is more for the current period, which I have published in the Journal of Common Market Studies. So I will look into the kind of historical evolution of the European role in Israel-Palestine, and I will do so in 4 periods. The initial period surrounding the Rome Treaty, then the period in which European foreign policy cooperation emerges, the period after the Cold War and in the US unipolar moment, and the last more multipolar period, which starts with the economic crisis, the Arab uprisings, and where we find ourselves now. So, of course, the European community is founded with the Rome Treaty in 1957. That is just a few months after the invasion of Egypt of the UK, France, and Israel. It also takes place during the Algerian War of Independence. Indeed, Algeria is initially associated with the European community. So what we should bear in mind here, that we are now moving to the European community, to the European Union, is that, of course, there is a particular colonial history of the European community that we should take into consideration. P.O. Hansen and Stefan Johnson have written a brilliant book about this. But what I would like to stress is that we also need to be aware that this move of foreign policy from the European states level to the European community level kind of obscures the very concrete historical responsibilities which continue to sit at the member state level for Israel-Palestine, and which both a political but also, of course, an analytical move from the state level to the community level ignores. The European community projects an image of a civilian power Europe onto the world, which distances itself from the European past without taking actual responsibility for it. Historical responsibility is typically relegated to a distant other, and moving along analytically also means, of course, not looking into these concrete ongoing legacies set by European colonialism, by European anti-Semitism. And so there is no concrete recognition of the impact which this European history has had on the Palestinians. Moving to the period after Arab independence and the Suez Crisis, the Suez Crisis in particular, regional politics are no longer dominated by Europe, but by the US and the Soviet Union, who cooperate to manage what they call the Arab-Israeli conflict through the United Nations initially. This European non-role becomes of increasing concern to the Europeans in wake of the 1967 and 1973 wars, which raised from a European perspective both security and economic concerns, particularly, of course, due to the oil boycott. So the European political cooperation on foreign policy is formed in 1970, and it begins to define foreign policy also on the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, what is very interesting to observe in light of the theme of this panel in that period is that the discourse of the Europeans begins to change quite fundamentally. In the 1950s and 60s, Europeans had been no longer concerned with the issue of a Palestinian state as in the partition plan, but only referred to the Arab refugee issue, which has implicitly denied Palestinians both their national identity and their right to self-determination. In 1973, instead, we see quite a sea change in discourse as the member states proceed with the following statement, which you can see here, where for the first time they speak of the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, now acknowledged as a people, and the need to end the occupation in line with international law. Shortly later, they start to speak of a Palestinian homeland. And even stronger is the Venice Declaration, which you can see here, which evidences European discomfort with the US-brokered Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which excluded the Palestine question. Again, what you can see here is that the Nine insist on international law, on the Palestinian right to self-determination, on the illegality of the settlements, on including the PLO into negotiations. But they also insist on two other points that I would like to draw your attention to, which is they insist on deoccupation and they insist on the UN as a guarantor, which of course, with the entrance of the US as mediator and monitor, the UN has gradually lost this role in the conflict. What, however, you do not find in this declaration is a right to a state. In other words, the declaration was different to the US position, but also to the position of the UN General Assembly, which in the same year, in 1980, determined the Palestinian right to a state. Some research claims that the EU is a normative power because it pushed the US into adopting the idea of Palestinian statehood, but this is somewhat incorrect because the normative push towards the right to statehood comes from the UN General Assembly, the non-aligned movement, and the Arab states, because at that time they were quite united on that issue and put pressure on the Europeans. So we could see this was a period where Arab unity on that particular foreign policy issue had an impact on European foreign policy. Let's then move into the next period, the end of the Cold War, which is the onset of the so-called US unipolar moment and of the so-called international liberal order. That order never led to liberty in the Arab world. Indeed, freedom in the Arab world drops significantly, as can be seen in this graph, where non-free states rise and partially free states decline. Now, this graph evidences a structural context in which, so you can see the non-free states are red, the hybrid states are yellow, and the free states are green. So this graph evidences a structural context in which Arab governments do not need consent of their populations for their foreign policies, including the peace process, which sets on in its various formations from the Oslo process to today's normalization process. Now, in this unipolar moment, both the Arab world and Europe move under the US umbrella. In the Arab world, there is less focus on the pan-Arabism of the 1960s and 70s or the Arab regionalism of the 70s and 80s. So there is actually less focus on Arab unity and more emphasis on state sovereignty. Fearing the rise of Iran, most Arab Gulf states move closer to the US, also militarily speaking. The Europeans enlarge the EU, but in an enlarged European Union, it is difficult to find consensus. So the move under this US umbrella of the Middle East peace process initially ensures also coherence amongst Europeans. US productive power in that moment is quite preponderant and evident in the peace process, and how the Arab states and the Europeans link into that and begin to somewhat diverge from their own focus on international law, Palestinian rights, the United Nations, and deoccupation. They all sign up to the idea that the occupied people in the Palestinian territory need to negotiate their rights with the occupying power, which gives the latter a de facto veto over that. This is evident, for example, in the 2002 Arab peace plan. It begins to speak of a just solution for the Palestinian refugees, while the 1980 Fah plan had insisted on UN Resolution 194. The Europeans, while they continue to insist, of course, on the illegality of the settlements, including later on with the differentiation policy, they no longer insist on deoccupation or on the role of the United Nations. Nowhere is this, for example, included in the paradigmatic. Now it doesn't move anymore. Okay, thank you very much. In the paradigmatic 1999 Berlin Declaration, the Berlin Declaration speaks of a Palestinian state as an option to be achieved through negotiations, thus not as a right. Furthermore, after the parliamentary elections in 2006, the EU follows the US no-contact policy with Hamas, which reinforces the division of the Palestinian political community. The European Union could have set up the same conditions for all actors, that is to comply with international law. So that would have actually strengthened the so-called international rules-based order, but that's not what the EU does. So what you see in the 1990s is a productive power of the United States, producing what Michel Patch and Somdi Sen have called the script of a peace process, which the Arabs and Europeans largely sign up to, and which has de facto never produced peace. It also appears that in this process, the capacity of the Europeans and the Arabs to produce their own script for peace, rooted in international law and in the international community as embodied by the United Nations, has largely been lost. Let's then move into the multipolar world, which IR scholars place roughly around the economic crisis of 2008. At that point, it is quite clear that the peace process has failed, has de facto resulted in the entrenchment of a one-state reality, where Palestine figures in urban enclaves. Tarek Bakoni has called this the Gazification of Palestine. The Europeans acknowledge single human rights violations in this reality, but do not acknowledge the structure in which these human rights violations occur systematically, and which leading local and international human rights organizations have described as a form of apartheid. Furthermore, in 2011, the Arab world becomes not only divided, but splits up deeply. And the PLO at that point decides to turn to the so-called rules-based order and presents its non-member observer status to the UN. Palestine accedes to the Rome Statute in 2015 and refers the case of Palestine to the International Criminal Court. And what we can see now is that the Europeans become divided. Yeah, you can see that here, that in 2003, votes in the UN General Assembly on asking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the building of a wall, the Europeans abstained together. The second slide is the votes of the European member states in 2022, always in the UN General Assembly, regarding the case of the Palestinian right to self-determination referred by the UN General Assembly to the ICJ. And here you can see how divided actually the Europeans have been to vote on that. Now remember that in 1980, the 9 foreign ministers had actually insisted on the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, on the Palestinian right to self-determination, and on an end of occupation. This is precisely what the court is asked to look into in 2022. However, you can see that the Europeans are no longer united on that. So how can we explain this? And how can we also explain that for 2 years, the EU has taken virtually no action in line with the requests of the International Court of Justice to protect the Palestinian people under the Genocide Convention? Now, I was trying to find an answer to this question in this latest article of mine, because EU behavior doesn't make sense from a rationalist, realist view, so from what I call the logic, or what is in the IR literature called the logic of consequentiality, nor does it make a lot of sense from a value and norm-driven perspective, or what in the IR literature is called the logic of appropriateness, because the European Union undermines its global standing, as well as international law, in which it has a vested strategic and normative interest. And so an answer to that question might be that the EU is still based in or returning to what I have called a logic of coloniality in this particular case, and others like Hans Kudnani have called Euro-whiteness, where our democracies, the European project, and the international order it produces feature ethno-religious, if not racist, hierarchies in which Palestinians figure as partially rightsless subjects, or in other words, in legal subalternity, as R.D. Imsays has termed it. And this partial rightslessness is, of course, not of Palestinians, is not without consequences for our own democracies. There is, of course, a boomerang effect to it, and we could also see that in these days here. So I would stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation et cette remise en perspective historique de la politique étrangère de l'Europe vis-à-vis de la question de Palestine. Je vais laisser la parole à Mandy Turner. Vous êtes, Mandy, chercheuse associée à la Queen Mary University of London et au think tank Overseas Development Institute, qui est spécialisé dans le développement et l'humanitaire. Et vos travaux portent sur l'économie politique des conflits et de la paix, l'humanitaire, le multilatéralisme et évidemment sur la situation en Israël et en Palestine. Et je signale la publication de votre récent ouvrage « From the River to the Sea, Palestine and Israel in the Shadow of Peace », traduit récemment en arabe. Et donc, je vous cède la parole pour une intervention que vous avez intitulée « La construction de la paix occidentale comme contre-insurrection en Palestine occupée ». Je vous remercie.
Thank you. There's a couple of seats down here if anybody that's standing at the back want to come down. I want to start by thanking the organisers for pushing back on censorship and defending academic freedom. What you've done here this week has implications for academic freedom across Europe. It says we will not be dictated to by the state, nor by lobby groups. So thank you very, very much for making this possible. I'm going to start my talk by making one strong claim, which I will then try to back up by analysis based on historical sociology methods and historical counterfactual methods. Understanding what is happening in Palestine and Israel through terms such as peace, peace building, and two-state solution masks the reality because it's using terms that's acceptable to everyone, but they have hidden meaning. So we need to unpack what these terms mean in the specific context of Palestine. So my analysis today will be predominantly focused on the past 30 years, but it still applies to the present day, and I'll make some final comments about the peace plans at the moment. I want to start by making a small disclaimer. It's the last vestige of the scoundrel. This conference is focused on Europe, but it is very difficult, I believe, to distinguish between what Europe does with what the United States and Britain does in terms of Palestine and Israel. I'm not talking about rhetoric, I'm talking about overall policy practice. In his talk this morning, Azmi Bashara also made the point that Europe has become America's junior partner in terms of policy towards the Middle East, and that's obviously correct. Now, Europe could and could still act differently to the United States, but but it chooses not to. So I'm not only focusing on Europe, I'm focusing on the West in general. I also know that there's differences between European states, and these are getting wider. For instance, I don't think we can look at Ireland and Spain in the same way as we can look at Germany and Britain. But because of time constraints, I'm going to be talking about Western states as a whole. So my strong claim is that one of the central causes of the October 7th, 2023 attack by Hamas and other Palestinian groups on Israel lies in Western policy towards Palestine and Israel, which I have called in many publications, peace-building as counterinsurgency. Now, I'll back up this claim by briefly outlining the past 30 years of the Oslo peace framework in Palestine and Israel. In historical sociology, we analyse events, such as October 7th, through 3 layers. We look at longer-term structural reasons, we look at proximate causes, and then we look at immediate triggers. Now, the longer-term structural reason for Hamas's attack is Israel's settler colonial apartheid system, because processes of dispossession and violence will always provoke opposition. The proximate cause of the attack was that the Oslo Accords and the Oslo Framework turned into a counterinsurgency tool. This is primarily because Israel was not forced to stick to its side of the agreements, whereas Palestinians were subjected to increasing and ever-accumulating forms of control dressed up in the language of reform. The immediate trigger for the attack was the potential extension of the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia, because the Abraham Accords ignore the question of Palestinian rights, despite rhetoric to the contrary. So at each of these levels, these 3 levels, long-term, proximate, and trigger, the West has played a crucial determining role. Now, I'll leave aside the longer-term structural reasons of Israel's settler colonial apartheid system over Palestinians, mostly because that's already been covered by earlier panels. I will focus on the intermediate level of proximate causes and make some short concluding remarks about the current peace plans. So the proximate cause of October the 7th was the Oslo Framework, which was developed in the aftermath of the peace agreements of 1993 to 1995. And this is where my peace-building as counterinsurgency framework is useful. My basic argument is that Oslo turned into counterinsurgency. Whether it was designed to be or not, I will leave to another discussion, but this is what it turned into. So what do I mean by peace-building as counterinsurgency? Well, counterinsurgency doctrine, or COIN for short, was developed by the French and the British to control their empires and defeat anti-colonial movements. The United States used COIN during the Cold War to defeat nationalist and socialist movements that challenged its economic and strategic interests. Counterinsurgency techniques were developed and applied by the British in Palestine, by the French in Algeria and Indochina, and by the Americans in Vietnam and Latin America. COIN was also applied during the United States War on Terror, and American General David Petraeus and other military strategists proposed a COIN for the 21st century that was codified in the 2007 US Counterinsurgency Field Manual. There's a lot that could be said about this, but what's important for my argument is that Petraeus and others argued that COIN had similar goals and strategies as human security and Western peace building. And in 2010, Petraeus made this argument directly to Mary Kaldor, who's one of the most prominent scholars of human security. By that point, human security had been operationalized into the security development nexus and the donor priority that development requires security. And this is what underpinned donor programs of security sector reform, state building, and good governance that was implemented by donors through their aid strategies. Local elites were to be co-opted, and elites who tried to resist these policies were to be marginalized and silenced. Now, the shared ontologies of peace building and COIN on the causes, consequences, and techniques of dealing with instability and conflict are clear and recognizable. The goal of both is to stabilize and pacify a society by promoting certain policies as related to governance, development, and security. But peace building does not operate in a vacuum. It takes place in specific socio-economic and political settings and affects these societies in specific ways. The ways in which Western peace-building practices intervened or intertwined with Israel's colonization practices created the inherently unstable and hugely violent political economy that's been experienced by Palestinians over the past 30 years. Now, Israel's counterinsurgency strategies against the Palestinian people involve what is referred to by coin specialists as kinetic techniques, otherwise killing power, that covers direct military intervention, mass incarceration, detention without trial, torture, house demolitions, target assassinations, and collective punishment. Israel also uses pacification techniques of population control, such as restrictions on movement, marriage and residency, and a closure regime of checkpoints, barriers, and a separation wall. The basic principle is to make life for Palestinians impossible. So it's within this context that the usual activities in the peace-building toolbox, state building, security sector reform, democracy promotion, private sector economic promotion, and support for civil society, this was the context in which these were pursued. So in the context of the occupied Palestinian territory, these principles, these activities, operated as another layer of pacification techniques that meshed with the structures of domination created by Israel. So if we take these three different spheres in turn, I'll briefly outline what I mean by them. So the three spheres of governance, economic development, and security, we can see how these operated in practice in the case of Palestine. So in the case of governance, Western strategies focused on supporting certain Palestinian elites and embedding their power in opposition to other elites. Now, using aid to prop up preferred political elites is common in peace processes or at the end of conflict. But in this context, the Palestinian elites were those that Israel and Western donors decided were acceptable. The United States, obviously the most important donor, played the main role, but European states also played an important role. I have labelled this the Partners for Peace discursive framework, because Palestinian political elites who were accepted as partners for peace were the ones that had been vetted and agreed on by Israel. Now, they also had an advantage over their opponents because they were then able to access sources of aid and political support. But this framework provided the ideological rationale for disciplining Palestinian political leadership when it followed policies that Israel and its Western allies did not like. There are many examples over the years of how this has operated. It's been clearly visible when Palestinian elites have tried to hold Israel accountable in the UN, in the ICC, or in the ICJ. The Partners for Peace discursive framework masks external interference into Palestinian politics and is used to manipulate and control. In the area of economic development, Western strategies focused on supporting the development of infrastructure and through the Paris Economic Protocol, which was the economic part of the Oslo Accords. Now, problematically, the Palestinian Authority's fiscal revenues are collected by Israel through a tax clearance system. And Israel can decide not to transfer these revenues when it so wishes, and it's now withholding $188 million a month since October the 7th, which is 65% of the Palestinian Authority's revenues. This holds the Palestinian Authority to ransom. In the area of security, Western strategies have focused on creating a Palestinian security force that's able to assure stability. But in this context, this has meant promoting and regulating security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and Israel under the auspices of the Americans, under conditions of occupation and colonization. Their primary job has been to police resistance against Israel. So Western peace building has operated as another layer of pacification techniques which have acted to dismantle Palestinian resistance to Israel's colonization practices of dispossession, destruction, mass incarceration, de-development and ethnic cleansing. The net effect of the Oslo structures and the Western donor policies has been to ensure that Israel's security is prioritised, that Palestinian elites are prepared to accept the Oslo frameworks that were kept in place, and that budget support and aid were there just to prevent extreme poverty and political instability. Now, these strategies of peace building as counterinsurgency are packaged as legitimate tactics in the pursuit of peace. But in essence, the Oslo framework ended up in a situation in which Palestinians policed other Palestinians against resistance, while Israel continued to confiscate Palestinian land. However, I'm not saying that Palestinians had no agency, but their agency was restricted within a framework controlled by Israel and supported by Western donors, and this remains true today. So the ability of Palestinian elites to maneuver is limited to what Israel will accept, and Israel can control what they do by using bureaucratic techniques of cutting off tax transfers, shutting borders, rescinding travel documents, and of course it can use violent military actions. At crucial points, Western donors have also used diplomatic pressure, cut off aid, and sanctioned Palestinian political elites. We've seen this cycle repeat continuously over the past 30 years. Now, the first interim period of peace building as counterinsurgency that began after the first Oslo Accords ended with the failure of the Accords to lead to a final status agreement. Then we saw the outbreak of the Second Intifada in September 2000 and Israel's response of extreme forms of military violence. What was the West's response? The West's response was the roadmap to reimpose stability and re-establish peace building as counterinsurgency. Reform was the language, security was the objective. There was no attempt to impose any conditionalities on Israel. Western states could have intervened at this point to end the charade of a peace framework supposed to end in 1999, but they did not. Instead, after forcing reforms on the Palestinian Authority, including elections, Western states then refused to accept the result of the January 2006 election where Hamas was elected. The EU, as part of the Middle East Quartet, made future aid to the Palestinian Authority conditional on the new government committing to non-violence, recognition of Israel, and acceptance of previous agreements, including the Oslo Accords. But Hamas was elected because it rejected Oslo and because it was going to do something about the Palestinian Authority's corruption. So this was presumably what the Palestinian electorate wanted and why Hamas won. Now let's just imagine what might have happened if instead of isolating the Hamas government, Western states had engaged with it. And instead of supporting Israel unconditionally, Western states had demanded an end to Israel's occupation and colonization by using its powers of trade and diplomacy. Counterfactions are often used in historical and political analyses, so let's pose one here. If the West had not sanctioned and isolated the Hamas government, would we have seen the civil war between Hamas and Fatah and the split between the West Bank and Gaza? Would we have seen Israel's blockade on the Gaza Strip? Would we have seen October the 7th? My guess is that we might have seen a very different situation develop. But instead, the Oslo framework was reimposed with even greater levels of control. This led to an isolated and blockaded Gaza, an East Jerusalem cut off from the rest of the West Bank, and a West Bank archipelago of Palestinian towns and villages surrounded by Israel's illegal and ever-expanding colonies. It also led to an emboldened Israel, which could do whatever it wished without facing consequences. So I would like to argue that the proximate cause of the October 7th attack was that the Oslo Accords and the Oslo framework had turned into a counterinsurgency tool. Because imposing policies designed to promote stabilization and pacification, while an occupying state takes more land and uses more violence, will always provoke opposition. What is more difficult to predict is how, when, and in what form this will take. Abdul Razak Takriti outlined this during the British Mandate period. So this history is longer than the 30-year period I'm outlining here. How long have I got? Am I out? Oh, good. So as I say, this history's been going on longer. Okay, no problem. Mish mishkila. But now, yet again, we're seeing the very same language of peace being instrumentalized, not to end Israel's occupation, but to further entrench it, not to lead to Palestinian self-determination, but to deny it until an undefined future date, perhaps never. Colonial rule has been labelled a peace board. Reform of the Palestinian Authority replaces sovereignty. The US administration a few days ago announced that it is proposing to build what it's called alternate safe communities in Gaza, where Palestinians who are vetted by Israel will be allowed to live. This is exactly the same as the Strategic Hamlets program that America funded in Vietnam. Peacebuilding as counterinsurgency is what underpins the current post-war plans for Gaza. But on each occasion that a peace is forced on Palestinians, more violence is needed to make it work, both bureaucratic violence and military violence. And to justify their actions, Western states resurrect the mythical peace process. On the 7th of October 2025, for instance, European leaders used Trump's 20-point Gaza peace plan as a pretext to freeze talks about sanctions on Israel. Palestinian lawyer Diana Boutou has called the two-state solution the magic pill that, when swallowed, makes Western states forget their obligations under international law to end Israel's occupation and violation of Palestinian rights. So I will finish with a caution. Beware the language of ceasefire and peace. The language of ceasefire has been twisted to mean a ceasefire not of Israeli bombs, but of Palestinian demands for self-determination, dignity and freedom. The phrase, give peace a chance, is again being used to deflect calls for justice and accountability. If Western and specifically European states, I've given up with the British state, want to see peace with justice and want to uphold the right to self-determination and international law, then they need to change their approach. The approach should be decolonization. There are policies they can use, but they choose not to. Some panels tomorrow will be dealing with this specific issue. Thanks again to the organisers for upholding the right to academic freedom. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Mandy, pour cette présentation très stimulante et pour la présentation de cette notion de contre-insurrection, la manière dont les politiques européennes ont déformé certaines notions convenues. Je vais laisser donc maintenant la parole à Muriel Asseburg. Vous êtes chercheuse principale au sein de la division Afrique et Moyen-Orient au Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, Fondation pour la science et la politique. Vous êtes également chercheuse à l'Institut allemand des affaires internationales et de sécurité à Berlin. Et vos recherches portent sur les dynamiques de conflit et la consolidation de la paix au Levant, c'est-à-dire en Israël, Palestine et en Syrie en particulier, sur les politiques moyen-orientales de l'Allemagne, de l'Europe et des États-Unis, et sur les questions de construction étatique, de réforme politique et de sécurité en Méditerranée orientale. Et votre intervention aujourd'hui porte sur une lecture critique des rôles de l'Union européenne en Palestine, dans laquelle vous allez nous présenter les deux grands mantras qui caractérisent sa politique à l'égard de la Palestine. Je vous en prie.
Thank you so much, François. I would like to join the earlier speakers in thanking the organizers. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm very, very happy that this is taking place in spite of the political pressure that's been exerted to stop people from speaking. I will focus my remarks on the period between the start of the peace process, or the so-called peace process, and 7 October 2023. And I think in this period, it becomes very clear that while the EU and its member states consider themselves as a guarantor of human rights, of international law, or how they like to call themselves, the normative power Europe. Actually, that's kind of an old term. They don't call themselves any longer like that, but they used to call themselves in this period like it. There is a huge gap between this rhetoric and the concrete European policies, and in particular, when we look at Israel-Palestine. I do want to look at this through two mantras that Europeans have been repeating time and again, and two mantras that are closely interlinked. And that brings me back to some of the issues that both Daniela and Mandy have already mentioned. The first mantra of European policies in this period has been that Europeans will support a two-state solution as the only viable approach to the conflict, while at the same time, Europeans have shied away from exerting any pressure and pushing that forward, and in particular, shying away from recognition of the state of Palestine. And the second related mantra is that the EU has supported reform of the Palestinian political system or the Palestinian Authority as a cornerstone of peace building, of state building, while at the same time it has deprioritized self-determination. So all the efforts at reform were actually not meant to build a viable, sovereign Palestine, but rather not to get there. Without doubt, the EU and its predecessors have in many respects been a forerunner in formulating positions or in taking positions that others have formulated before to relevant international fora. And we've spoken already in this session about some of the key declarations like the Venice Declaration, the Berlin Declaration, the Seville Declaration, that have led to a framing of the Palestine issue, focusing in this framing on the right to self-determination, the idea of Palestinian statehood, and parameters for conflict resolution based on the 1967 lines. And Europe has been, I would say, a key actor in shaping international language, bringing that into Security Council resolutions and other fora, basing their work, as Daniela has outlined, on what others have done before. Since the beginning of the Oslo process, the EU and its member states have also turned into the biggest donor for Palestinians in the larger sense, supporting state and institution building, civil society, the UN Refugee and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. Even though we have to see clearly that the trend since the Second Intifada has been that an ever-increasing percentage of European support has gone into humanitarian and emergency aid, and ever more restrictions have applied on funding for civil society in Palestine. At the same time, the EU and its member states have had a very, very limited role in really shaping conflict dynamics on the ground. I assume that other speakers will go into more depth why this has been the case. I would say there are at least three main factors. One, that the EU and its member states have accepted all through that the US is the main facilitator, the dominant force in the Middle East, and the EU and its member states generally hasn't questioned that. Second one being that EU member states have hidden behind Brussels rather than being a proponent of EU policies. So in cases where we have had progressive stances of a high representative, the EU member states haven't put their weight behind it, but rather have preferred or prioritized their bilateral relations with Israel over supporting EU institutions and EU representatives. And then third, and I think that has been illustrated by some of the slides that Daniela has shown, the divisions among EU member states that are based in historical experiences that are different from member state to member state, in different national identities, in different political cultures, in a varying degree of closeness to the US, have all led to weakening the EU as a power and weakened the activeness of the EU. We have seen that since 2016, the EU wasn't able to produce joint council conclusions on the Middle East. There hasn't been unity in voting in the UN, and the divisions have increased even more after 7 October, so that there hasn't been any agreement on the way forward and the use of available instruments, be it the question of an embargo of weapons deliveries, be it the question of sanctions, be it a more consistent differentiation, be it the question of recognition of the State of Palestine, be it the suspension of the association agreement with Israel, you name it. No agreement on any of these issues. I would say that actually quite early on in the Oslo process, we can speak of Europeans being in a state of strategic confusion when it comes to the Palestine question, and rhetoric and actual policies have widened, or the gap between them has widened ever more. And as I said, this shows in particular to these two mantras. So let me speak about this first mantra, the two-state solution. The EU and its member states have held that conflict resolution has to occur through a two-state solution, and to be more precise, a negotiated two-state solution. And there couldn't be any alternative to that. By doing so, the EU from the start, and member states from the start, have given Israel a veto over Palestinian self-determination. And at the same time, when you look all through this period from the early 1990s through to 2024, Europeans haven't ever seriously considered using the leverage that they potentially can have to push towards a two-state solution. So the instruments that Europeans actually have at hand to affect the cost-benefit analysis of parties to the conflict, and in particular Israel, haven't been used, haven't been employed, haven't even been seriously discussed. And therefore, even when Europeans have criticized Israel, for example, for its settlement policies, for annexation policies, that hasn't incurred any cost for Israel. And it was also clear to Israel that it wouldn't incur any cost. Just to give one example, in 2008, the EU decided that the formal upgrade of relations between EU and Israel that had already been decided was to be suspended. And in 2012, the EU decided to suspend meetings of the EU-Israel Association Council. But the message that could have gone to Jerusalem from these signals was completely deflected, because at the same time we see an ever closer cooperation between Israel and EU institutions, for example, in the context of Horizon 2020. We see an ever closer cooperation between EU and member states, and particularly so in the field of military cooperation, arms cooperation, and intelligence cooperation. So while there was a formal holding of the upgrade of relations, in reality, relations between the EU and Israel have become ever closer, and that has been the trend all through. And therefore, all the signals that Europeans might have wanted to give through their rhetoric haven't been received at the other end. Mandy has also already spoken about that. Never ever has been there a conditioning of contacts or of cooperation with Israeli actors. We see that Israel is accusing Europeans time and again of being anti-Israel, of being anti-Semitic, of being one-sided in favor of the Palestinians. But actually, the opposite is true when we look at how Europeans deal with Israelis and with Palestinians, because after the Hamas election victory in 2006, it is Europe that conditioned the contacts with the Palestinians on their commitment to the recognition of Israel, the commitment to agreements signed earlier, and the renunciation of violence. People find it often strange even to think about that this could be an ask of Israeli interlocutors or Israeli partners. But of course, one could just refer to commitment to international law from all partners that Europeans want to work with. That hasn't been the case. What also I think is important to look at is the lowering of ambitions that we have seen over the last decade before October 7. The entrenchment of a one-state reality with unequal rights has led the Europeans, and the failure of the last US mediation talks in 2014 actually has led to a European position that has said our ambition is no longer to contributing to the implementation of a two-state solution, but rather to maintaining that option on the table. When we look at relevant EU documents, we see that while, for example, in the 2003 EU security strategy, Israel-Palestine is still seen as a key conflict, and engagement there is seen as a strategic priority. Look, 13 years later, in 2016, the EU global strategy, Israel-Palestine is no longer a strategic priority. It is no longer considered a key conflict. And of course, I've already said it, Europeans have not recognized Palestine, the state of Palestine, even though in the Berlin Declaration in 1999, they announced that that recognition would follow in due time. Apparently, they have felt that time never is due to recognize Palestine. Worse than that, not only have Europeans not recognized Palestine, I said I'm speaking not on the last 2 years, of course, they have also pushed the Palestinian leadership not to go for declaration of independence. They have pushed the Palestinian leadership not to join international organizations. They have pushed the Palestinian leadership not to go for international jurisdiction and international justice. And therefore, I would say they have not only not worked themselves for realizing the right of self-determination, they have also actively worked against it and tried to prevent Palestinians from realizing it themselves in, anyhow, a worse international situation. I would therefore say that the EU and its member states share very much in the responsibility for the failure of the Oslo approach, in the failure to achieve steps towards realizing Palestinian self-determination. They have actively undermined Palestinian efforts at self-determination and have always prioritized close relations with Israel. So they share also in the responsibility for the relapse into existential conflict over all of territory of British Mandate Palestine that has occurred, of course, before October 7, not on October 7. So the EU and its member states bear responsibility here, which doesn't mean that they are the only, and maybe not even the most important actor, but they are an important actor. And it's only after the horrors of what is happening in Gaza that suddenly EU representatives and member states have started again making conflict resolution a talking point, that we see a willingness of at least some EU member states to use leverage that they have, that they speak about recognizing the state of Palestine, that some of them have recognized the state of Palestine, that there is talk about suspending the association agreement and so on. But also, and again, Mandy has already mentioned it seems to me that in Brussels there was a big sigh of relief before the last Foreign Affairs Council meeting, because with the ceasefire and the Trump plan, now finally Europeans don't have agree on any of these measures that would put them into confrontation with Israel. The second mantra is that the EU has been the main actor in support of what is called Palestinian institution building and reform, and they have always claimed that this would develop effective governance, state institutions, and would serve establishing the nucleus of a Palestinian state, thus serve self-determination. Yet, in reality, what we see, it's not been happening in the service of self-determination. What has actually happened is that all the reform that has taken place has not been aimed at establishing accountability of the Palestinian leadership towards their own population, towards their own people, but rather towards the donor community and international actors. And all that with the aim not of realizing self-determination, but rather upholding the regime that was established in Oslo, the regime of joint conflict management with the Palestinian Authority as a subcontractor of the occupation, with specific roles for it. So when we look at different periods of or episodes of reform and how Europeans have supported it, we see this, I think, very clearly. We see that, for example, in 2003, on European pressure in the context of the roadmap and with a lot of European consultancy for changing the constitution, an office of a prime minister was established so as to weaken the Palestinian president, not so as to make the system more democratic and more accountable to the Palestinians, but rather to weaken a person that was no longer considered helpful in reviving the peace process. And in installing somebody who has been willing to go along with continued cooperation and security coordination with Israel, whatever Israel, from the Israeli side came with regards to violations of the Oslo Accords. We have also seen all through that an ever more authoritarian governance by the Palestinian Authority hasn't incurred any cost for the Palestinian leadership. EU financial support that would usually or should have followed the principle of more for more in the context of the European neighborhood policy has been completely delinked when it comes to support for the Palestinian Authority from performance with regards to governance and human rights. And even in the situation where we saw their not so slow, but rather fast dismantling, the systematic dismantling, one has to say, of the separation of powers in the Palestinian Authority system, the dismantlement of all checks and balances and ever greater repression, the monopolization of power at the presidency, that at no point has led to a principled review of EU support to the Palestinian leadership. And that is exactly the case because it's not about establishing any kind of system that is accountable to the Palestinian people, but that fulfills the functions in the Oslo system. And we see that now there is quite a lot of panic, actually, in the sense that the PA is about to collapse, that it is being collapsed, one has to say, purposefully by the Israeli right-wing parties in the government. So European states see themselves forced to go back to direct budget support in order to avoid that collapse. Again, without conditionality in the sense of trying to go back to a more accountable system, but demanding reform that would serve the purposes of that system. First and foremost, reform of the security sector that makes the Palestinian security forces able to do what Mandy has said, counterinsurgency, rather than protection of the Palestinian people. We see that the reform that is being supported by the Europeans, that the Mustafa government is actually doing right now, is maybe aimed at making the government more effective, increase a bit the output legitimacy, but that doesn't affect the political system and the regime as such at all. I think one more layer in this, and that is important, is that demands for reform that have come from Europeans, maybe first and foremost from some member states, but have also been integrated in the EU reform agenda for the PA, have first and foremost satisfied or aimed at satisfying Israeli demands, imposing an Israeli narrative, deflecting from developments on the ground. I would like to mention the school book reform, an ongoing saga that will never satisfy, actually, but that is one of the issues. Then, of course, the reform of payments to political prisoners and martyrs. And this is also, I think, the pattern that we see when we look at reforms under the Trump 20-point plan, that this is, again, once more about capacity building for the security sector, and then reform that is actually aimed at limiting foreign policy options and options of the Palestinian Authority, rather than striving for accountability or a more accountable system. So the link that is made between the 20-point plan and the deal of the century actually imposes that the Palestinian leadership wouldn't be able to use recourse to international justice and international fora, and then Israel would have a veto over this reform progress or over the assessment of how far reforms have gone. And if they are happy, then the PA might be able also to play a role in Gaza. I see that this last bit has been no longer in the new draft of the Security Council resolution, but it's still in the Trump plan, of course, that the Security Council resolution refers to. The big problem, and I think I want to end on that, is that when we look at the Security Council resolution that is currently being drafted, and that the 20-point plan that has just been endorsed by the G7, that this will provide international legitimacy to potentially long-term military occupation of Gaza, the split of Gaza into two, the return to a mandate-like foreign rule under this Board of Peace, the continuation of the blockade and the entrenchment of the split between West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And the big question is here, if the Europeans can at least once live up to the approach that they have been working on, not as an EU, not as an EU 27, but at least some of the member states have been involved. And I'm speaking about the French-Saudi initiative, the Global Coalition for a Two-State Solution, and the New York Declaration that was widely accepted by the UN General Assembly. Now, one can also have a lot of criticism of these initiatives, but compare that to what we are currently being seen installed in Gaza, looks at least much less worse to me. Question is, will the Europeans fight for that alternative approach, or will in the end they be once more just an accessory to the scheme that the US administration and the Blair Initiative are currently rolling out?
Ça fonctionne. Merci infiniment pour cette présentation passionnante. Avant de laisser la parole au public, peut-être un petit mot de, je ne sais pas si on peut dire conclusion, mais de synthèse. Vos présentations suggèrent, j'aurais même tendance à dire montrent, que les politiques européennes n'ont pas été incapables ou inopérantes dans la mise en place d'un cadre politique et légal susceptibles de faire appliquer le droit, mais au contraire que ce sont des politiques actives, productives, conçues plutôt pour garantir le maintien d'un statu quo qui en fait n'en est pas un et qui contribue à la dépossession politique et territoriale. À plusieurs reprises dans vos interventions, j'ai entendu cette idée de, vous ne l'avez pas mentionné, mais de subversion de certains principes politiques qui auraient permis, sous couvert de respecter la grammaire justement de ces principes, de détourner l'attention pour poursuivre une politique qui ne va pas dans le sens de l'application du droit précisément. Daniela Huber, je ne prendrai qu'un seul exemple, mais j'ai entendu ça dans votre exposé, comment on est passé dans les années 50, 60, de la défense de l'autodétermination des Palestiniens à la seule question des réfugiés. Mandy Turner, comment la grammaire de la paix et du processus de paix a été complètement instrumentalisée dans cette logique que vous avez nommée une logique contre-insurrectionnelle. Et à l'instant, Muriel Asseburg, comment la solution à deux États et la question de la réforme des institutions palestiniennes sont devenus des instruments pour maintenir le système d'Oslo où l'autorité palestinienne agit comme sous-traitant de l'occupation, sans que jamais ces politiques finalement ne questionnent véritablement le système d'occupation. Voilà, je ne sais pas si c'est la bonne... en tout cas, l'histoire de cette impuissance, on pourrait à minima, je crois, mettre un point d'interrogation. Et je laisse la parole. Voilà, bah alors ça va. Alors, la première.
Hello, thanks a lot for the presentations. I have the question maybe for Mandy and Muriel. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of civil society in this context, in the context of kind of peace building or Western peace building, because I think that this kind of NGOization of Palestine and the framing of humanitarian aid is a particularly problematic one. Thanks.
Je prends une deuxième question, vous voulez?
Thank you. I think you've given a very clear picture of all the mistakes and the problems made. Could you talk a little bit about some of the reasons why this is? I mean, I suppose one explanation could be the supremacy of American policymaking and the sidelining of European power in this policymaking, but it could also perhaps be something about the role of knowledge and academic knowledge. I mean, these warnings have been clear from experts such as yourself for the last 20 years. So what are your views on why these failures have continued to happen so clearly?
Okay. It's a really good question on the issue of civil society and the NGOization. If you haven't read the book by Lisa Bongalia, which I've forgotten the name of for a minute, it's fabulous. What she does is she traces the way in which American counter-terrorism legislation has been imposed on NGOs in the West Bank. And this has created another level of counterinsurgency, basically. You manipulate who can access funds. You make it impossible for community-based organisations who don't sign the list, which means they can access donor funds. It then means that those who do get donor funds, there's a fundamental disjuncture between the grassroots and the NGOs, because they're not representing the people on the ground. So the Western funds that go, and the EU is also doing this. When I left Palestine in 2019, Western donors were telling me that they were starting to insist on that organisations that they were going to fund would not have signed up to boycott, divestment and sanctions. Now that's interfering in Palestinian politics, particularly given that BDS is a non-violent civil society-led organisation. So what's left? What's left for Palestinians to do? They're blocked from international legal mechanisms. They're blocked from BDS. It doesn't leave much space for them to do anything else. So you're absolutely right. The ways in which to talk about peace building through civil society, but then block different types of activities is problematic. Sunny, if I understood your question correctly, are you saying why is this happening? Oh my God, we need another conference. The brief version. Oh, Jesus Christ. I think the problem lies with the British. All problems lie with the British. All the problems lie with the British. So the British Empire and the idea of Britain's colonial control over the Holy Lands was important for its empire, right? And then the Americans have taken over after the Second World War period. And for all different reasons, basically strategic, racist, orientalist, and internal political lobbies, it's continued. The problem, of course, is that now we're in a situation where I think young people now, they don't buy it anymore. That's why we're seeing massive amounts of activities from young people, our students, our young people on the streets. They no longer buy this. There's a really big disjuncture between what the elites say and even who runs our universities, what they think, and what young people think. If you look at the opinion polls, it's vastly different. So while I think that the problem lies in European colonialism and racism, I think that the young people are no longer buying that. And that's because they are, you know, they've grown up with anti-racism, they've grown up with decolonization. That's their mantras at the moment, right? So I have hope in them for the future, that we can push towards a future where Palestine is not the victim anymore, that Palestine becomes the emblem of solidarity and freedom.
I'll try to add to what Mandy has said on the first question of civil society. When we look at the recent developments, I think it's striking and stark to see that after October 7, actually the EU slashed all funding for Palestinian civil society. I mean, a commissioner did that against his competency, but still he did it. So in a situation where the rhetoric was, we want to strengthen moderate elements against violent resistance, actually the EU did exactly the opposite. Before, we already saw that when Israel started criminalizing NGOs, the backbone of the Palestinian civil society, EU and its member states didn't really try to work against that and strengthen these organizations or support them, protect them. And we currently see this process that all international NGOs have to register and provide a lot of data and information about their local staff, international staff. And again, I don't see neither the Europeans nor other internationals actually trying to work on that issue, which will have very, very grave consequences for the ability of basically anybody to work in the Palestinian territories. On the other questions of the reasons, maybe four. I'll be short. 4 short reasons. A, racism. B, an interpretation of historical responsibility, and here I speak first and foremost about Germany, but it's also other member states, that translates into support for Israeli governments rather than any other kind of lessons that could be drawn from the horrors of the Holocaust and German wars of aggression. C, interest in close relations with Israel, and these interests have become even more important in the context of the war in Ukraine. And D, and maybe that links to the racism point, the strengthening of the right wing in Europe and their Islamophobic, anti-Arab stances, and a lot of admiration for Israeli policies.
Yeah, I just answered to your question, following up on what you said. Well, I think it's really a US preponderance which has produced this mantra of the peace process. And it began to produce it almost 50 years ago, right, when the US took over peacemaking from the United Nations. It took it over in '73 because the argument was the UN had failed. There were 2 wars, the UN had failed. Now we have 50 years of US failure in providing peace, which is very clear with what has happened in the last 2 years. So someone should start to question this mantra as well. And I think what is crucial here is why it's not really question is Arab weakness. What I tried to bring across in my talk is that the Europeans changed their position when there was Arab unity, and Arabs had a very clear position rooted in UN resolutions, for example. That is absent in this moment, right? The Arabs are as divided as the Europeans appear. And then, of course, the third answer is actually what I write in my article, that there is a logic of coloniality to this. Here I would link also to what Muriel said, because I think that this logic has grown also as a response to the growth of right-wing populism in Europe, which has shifted the discourse into that direction. I stop here.
Bon, alors on stoppe ce panel. Merci beaucoup infiniment à vous trois d'avoir présenté ces papiers et ces réflexions vraiment passionnantes. On va passer immédiatement au dernier panel de la journée consacré à l'uniformisation des politiques européennes. Je vous remercie.